There are two ways to cheat in a marriage. The first is with the body, and my husband, Marcus, was meticulously honest about that one. He scheduled his dates with a 28-year-old on our shared Google Calendar. The second way to cheat is with a pen, the discovery of that betrayal. His signature next to a very good forgery of mine was the one that finally turned my quiet suffering into a structural plan for his ruin. My office was a box of glass and white-painted drywall, cantilevered over a patch of ornamental grass that our landscape architect insisted was authentically Austin. I preferred to call it expensive hay. Under the sharp, lonely beam of a single track light, I sat at my desk, a slab of reclaimed but sterile white oak. The red ink in my pen was bleeding through the margins of a graduate student's paper. Derivative, I'd written. Where is your original analysis? I was grading on a curve, and not just for my architectural history students. I was grading my entire life that way, looking for any sign of originality. My phone vibrated against the oak, a sharp, clean bzzzt that was the loudest sound in the house. I glanced at the screen, 11:03 p.m., a calendar notification shared with my husband. Marcus, date night, Chloe. I didn't sigh. I hadn't sighed in months. I simply tapped the screen and the notification vanished. He was punctual, I'll give him that. The event was scheduled from 7 p.m. to 11 p.m. He was probably walking to his car right now, energized, vibrant, leaving Chloe's downtown condo. I pushed back from my desk. The chair, a minimalist ergonomic nightmare Marcus had chosen, squeaked in protest. The house was silent. It was always silent when he was gone. 22 years of marriage had earned us this: a 4,000 square foot echo chamber with museum-quality furniture and a shared Google Calendar that meticulously detailed my husband's infidelity. It had been a year since Marcus, 50 and frantic about it, had proposed the open relationship. He hadn't called it that. He'd called it a radical act of trust, a way to evolve past monogamy. He was the charismatic founder of a tech company that sold ethical data mining tools. And he spoke in the language of TED Talks and venture capital pitches. We're not just a couple. Elle, he'd said, pacing our cold, polished concrete living room floor. We're a platform. We can build on this. Honesty, transparency. It'll make us stronger. I, 48 and terrified of being alone, had translated. He meant, I'm bored, I feel old, and I want to sleep with younger women without the hassle of a divorce. I had seen the statistics. I knew what a woman my age, even an accomplished architectural historian, faced in the dating marketplace. So I'd agreed. I had compromised. I walked to the kitchen, the concrete cold under my bare feet. I'd tried to hold up my end of the bargain. I'd downloaded the apps. I'd met a divorced landscape architect for coffee and a biology professor for a chaste, awkward dinner. But I felt brittle, inorganic. I was a forgery of a single woman. My attempts felt like homework. His felt like a renaissance. He was flourishing. He'd lost 10 pounds, started a new, optimized workout routine, and his hair seemed thicker. The front door snicked open, the sound of the expensive, high-tech lock he'd insisted on. I heard his keys hit the glass bowl by the door. Alara, you're still up? His voice bounced off the hard surfaces. Marcus appeared in the kitchen entryway, pulling at the knot of his stylish, narrow tie. He was glowing, his skin flushed with that post-coital new relationship energy. He smelled of sandalwood and that bright, citrusy floral soap Chloe, 28 and an app designer, preferred. It wasn't my soap, just finishing up, I said, my voice flat. I opened the refrigerator, the sudden artificial light illuminating my face. How was your date? It was good. It was great, he said, already moving past me, shedding his jacket. He was a man in constant, frictionless motion. We brainstormed this incredible new UI for her project. She's just brilliant, Elle. Absolutely no ego. He was implying, as he always did, that I was the one with ego. That my quiet suffering, my reluctance to embrace this new life with the enthusiasm of a convert, was a failing. That's great, Marcus. He opened the other side of the stainless steel fridge and pulled out kale. a banana, and his proprietary blend of green powder. The blender whirred to life, a violent, grinding shriek that filled the silence I had been enjoying. He poured the sludge into a glass. "Listen," he said, wiping a green droplet from the white quartz countertop. "I've been meaning to talk to you. This was it. The administrative part of our arrangement. I had a meeting with the bank today," he said, casual. "I'm looking to invest in a new startup. Really groundbreaking stuff. Ethical AI, totally disruptive." I leaned against the counter, my arms crossed. "Marcus, your portfolio is already heavy on tech." I know. But this one is a sure thing, Elle." He took a sip of his smoothie, his eyes bright over the rim of the glass. "It's going to secure our future." Our future. I'd heard that phrase before. It usually preceded a large purchase that benefited him. "What do you need?" I asked. "Well, to get the kind of stake I want, I need to free up some more capital." The bank suggested a second mortgage on the house. A cold, heavy stillness settled in my stomach. The house, the one thing that was half mine, the one solid object in my dissolving life. "A second mortgage," I repeated. "It wasn't a question. It's just paperwork, Alara, a formality." He smiled, that brilliant, charming CEO smile that had raised millions of dollars and broken my heart. "The valuation on this place is insane. We'd barely even feel it. I would feel it." I felt the dread creeping up my throat, tasting like pulverized grass and anxiety. "You're not drinking your half," he said, nudging the second glass of green sludge he'd poured for me. I looked at the glass. I looked at him. "I need to think about it, Marcus." Of course. He was already magnanimous, already moving on. "I'll leave the preliminary documents on your desk. They're just standard forms. Take a look." He rinsed his glass in the sink, kissed my forehead, a dry proprietary peck that smelled of kale and Chloe, and headed upstairs, his steps light. I stayed in the kitchen for a long time. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator. I walked back to my office and sat down. The red-marked paper was waiting. On top of it sat a slim, crisp manila folder. I picked up my pen, but I didn't look at the student's paper. I stared at that folder. A formality. I opened it. Marcus was asleep. I'd heard him upstairs. The muffled sounds of his nightly routine, the electric toothbrush, the whoosh of his weighted blanket. He always fell asleep instantly, the privilege of a clear conscience or a profound lack of one. I sat in my office, the manila folder centered perfectly on my desk blotter. The house was quiet again, a sterile vacuum. For a moment, I just stared at the folder, a formality. The casualness of his lie was its own kind of insult. My hand was steady as I opened it. The documents were exactly what he'd said. Standard preliminary forms from the bank. A loan application, a summary of our shared assets, a request for a property appraisal. And there, on the application form, was the name of the beneficiary. The investment, Innovate, LLC. It was the most generic, buzzword-laden name he could have possibly chosen. It sounded like one of his corporate retreats. Innovate, disrupt, evolve. I'd spent my entire adult life as a historian. My specialty was deconstructing the facades of buildings, reading the blueprints to understand the intent behind the design. I didn't just look at a cathedral and see beauty. I saw a 1,000-year-old financial statement, a map of political power, a story of human ambition carved in stone. Marcus, for all his talk of the future, had forgotten what I did for a living. I didn't just accept documents. I interrogated them. I pushed his folder aside and pulled my personal laptop toward me. Not the university-issued one. This one was mine. I clicked it open, the keyboard backlighting casting a faint blue glow on my hands. I'd made a fresh pot of coffee an hour ago. It was cold now, but I drank it anyway. The taste was bitter, acidic. It matched my mood. My fingers moved with the practiced, rhythmic click-clack of a researcher. First, the Texas Secretary of State Business Entity Database. It was public record. I typed in the name. Innovate LLC at a result appeared. Filed 6 months ago. My stomach tightened. 6 months. He'd been planning this for a while. The registered agent was a generic legalservicesinc.com address in a downtown high-rise. A dead end? But the principal office address was different. It wasn't a corporate park. It wasn't an incubator. It was a residential address. Unit 1408 at the Pacer, one of those new glass and steel condo towers where the one-bedrooms started at $1 million. I knew that building. I'd walked past it on my awkward, obligatory dates, feeling like a ghost haunting the new, vibrant city that Marcus loved and I no longer recognized. I copied the address. I opened a new tab. The Travis County Property Tax Database, another public record. I pasted the address into the search bar. Property ID 7854B011408. I clicked. The page loaded. The current owner's name populated the field. Lang. Chloe. Our eyes stopped breathing. The hum of the computer's fan seemed to swell, filling the entire room. I read the name again, and again. Lang. Chloe R. Chloe. His 28-year-old brilliant protege. The app designer. The woman whose citrus floral soap was embedded in my husband's skin. My mind started connecting the blueprints. We brainstormed this incredible new UI for her project. It's a sure thing, Elle. He wasn't investing in a startup. He was funding her. He wanted to take our home, the single solid thing we had built together, the repository of 22 years of life, and leverage it. He wanted me to co-sign on its destruction so he could use the equity to buy his mistress a company. The open relationship flashed before my eyes, a piece of cheap, distracting stage magic. It was never about honesty. It was never about trust or evolution. It was a tool. It was a brilliantly designed system to keep me distracted, to make me feel insecure and old-fashioned, to make my valid objections to his behavior seem like inhibitions and ego. He'd needed me to be so busy managing my own emotional devastation over the sex that I wouldn't pay, attention to the money. He wasn't just a cheater. He was a thief. The bitterness I'd been swallowing for a year, the bile that rose every time he came home smelling of her, didn't make me want to scream. It didn't make me cry. It crystallized. It turned into something structural, a load-bearing wall. The feeling that flooded my veins was cold, pure, and absolutely clear. It was the ice of absolute certainty. I closed the property tax database. I closed the Secretary of State's website. I took the manila folder and slid it back into my desk drawer, neat and tidy. Then I opened a new application, a fresh, blank, encrypted spreadsheet, the kind I used for complex research data, protected by a 24-character password. In cell A1, I typed a title, Vance. M, Financial Analysis. I labeled the columns, date, transaction, account, amount, beneficiary. Notes. I looked at the clock. 3:14 a.m. I began my work. I slept for exactly 2 hours. When my alarm chimed at 5:30 a.m., I rose, showered, and dressed. I didn't look in the mirror. I didn't need to. I knew the face I was wearing. I was in the kitchen, emptying the dishwasher with quiet, economical movements when Marcus came downstairs. He was wearing his favorite Lululemon joggers and a threadbare t-shirt from a dot-com boom-era startup he'd bankrupted. He saw it as a badge of honor. Failure is just data. He looked wary, expecting the chill of the previous night. Morning, I said, my voice bright. I slid a warm, white ceramic mug into its place in the cupboard. I made coffee. He stopped, surprised. Oh, thanks, Elle. He moved to the espresso machine, his bare feet whispering on the concrete. Smells good. I turned, leaning back against the cool quartz of the island. I let my face arrange itself into an expression of thoughtful consideration. Marcus, I looked over that paperwork. He tensed, preparing for a fight. And I think you're right, I said. His posture didn't just relax. It inflated. His shoulders broadened, his chin came up. He was the inflatable man, and I had just found the nozzle. You do? Yes. I pushed off the counter and walked toward him, picking up an imaginary piece of lint from his shoulder. His skin was warm. We've been stagnant. I've been stagnant. I let a small, vulnerable sigh escape. You're always pushing us to be bold, to evolve. I've been holding us back. Elle, I knew you'd see it, he said, his voice thick with smug relief. He placed his hands on my shoulders, his thumbs rubbing my collarbone. It's a brilliant move. This startup is going to secure everything. I know it will, I said, meeting his gaze. I trust you. I trust your vision. He was so thrilled, so blinded by my sudden, miraculous conversion, that he kissed me. It was a real kiss, not the dry peck from the night before. It was proprietary and triumphant. I tasted the bitter grounds of his espresso and the faint, sour tang of his self-satisfaction. I did not recoil. I simply accepted it, a necessary transaction. I'll call the bank today and schedule the appraisal, I said, stepping back. All business. We should move on this quickly. Absolutely. God, Ilara, that's fantastic. In fact, I said, turning to stack the last plate, we should celebrate. The three of us. He froze. The three of us? You, me, and Chloe. I said her name like I was tasting a new kind of wine. Bright, citrusy. You said yourself she's brilliant. If we're investing in her company, I should get to know her. As a partner, I smiled. It's all about honesty, right? Transparency? He was speechless. He stared at me as if I'd just solved quantum gravity. He thought he had finally broken me in, like a difficult horse. He believed he was the most enlightened, progressive man in Austin. Ilara, he breathed, grabbing my hand. Yes, I'll set it up. I smiled. Good. Now I have to run. I have a meeting at the university. Right. Of course, he was practically vibrating. Have a great day, Elle. You too, Marcus. I grabbed my bag and my keys. I walked out of our cold, minimalist house, got into my practical, boring sedan, and did not drive to the university. My meeting was in a squat, unremarkable brick building on the other side of town, far from the gleaming Tech Bro towers. The sign on the frosted glass door read, Finley and Associates, Forensic Accounting. The office inside smelled of stale coffee, old paper, and the faint, sharp scent of lemon oil furniture polish. The carpet was a durable industrial gray. An older woman with a magnificent gray beehive hairdo looked up from a massive humming printer. Dr. Vance, Mr. Finley is expecting you. Arthur Finley was the opposite of Marcus. He was in his late 60s, with a tweed jacket that had actual leather patches on the elbows. His desk was a mountain of paper, but I could see it was an organized system. A ticking wooden clock on his wall was the only sound. He shook my hand. His was dry and strong. Doctor, please. He gestured to a worn, leather-bound chair. Thank you for seeing me on such short notice, Mr. Finley. Arthur, please. Your university provost is let's say, a grateful old client of mine. What can I do for you? I had rehearsed this. The plan required a cover. Arthur, I'm on the board for a new academic grant, a historical preservation fund. We're in the final stages of vetting a major private donor. It's all very sensitive. He nodded, his face impassive. Due diligence. Exactly, I said. The foundation is a labyrinth of LLCs. I need to know discreetly where the money is coming from and where it's really going. Understood. He pulled a yellow legal pad toward me. Do you have the entity names and account information you know of? I reached into my bag and pulled out a single encrypted USB drive. Not my new spreadsheet, just the raw data I'd pulled last night. The account numbers I shared with Marcus. The name Innovate LLC, he took the drive. This is a good start. My team will begin tracing the public-facing assets immediately. I leaned forward. The performance was over. That's the cover story, Arthur. Now for the real one. His eyebrows, bushy and gray, lifted a fraction of an inch. That drive also contains my personal financial records. And my husband's. His name is Marcus Vance. Arthur's eyes sharpened. He knew the name. Everyone in Austin knew the name. I am not vetting a donor, I said, my voice low and cold. I am building a case. I believe my husband is using our shared assets to fraudulently fund a mistress's company. I've agreed to a second mortgage on our home that will, I suspect, be funneled directly to her. I slid a second piece of paper across the desk. It had one line on it: Chloe R. Lang, Unit 1408, The Pacer. Arthur Finley looked at the name, looked at me, and then put his pen down. The ticking of the clock seemed to get louder. "Dr. Vance," he said, his voice quiet, "this is no longer due diligence. This is a domestic matter." "It's a financial matter," I corrected him, my voice hard as steel. "He is commingling, he is misrepresenting, and I suspect this is just the blueprint. I want to know about every dollar he has moved without my knowledge for the past 5 years. I want to know every account he's hidden, every asset he's leveraged. I want a complete architectural survey of his entire financial life, and I want it to be invisible." Arthur stared at me for a long moment. He'd seen this before. Maybe not this exact scenario, but he knew the look. He knew the crystalline, load-bearing rage. He picked his pen back up. "My services are not inexpensive, Doctor. I am an architectural historian, Mr. Finley. I know the value of a solid foundation." He nodded slowly, then made a note on his pad. "If your suspicions are correct, and in my experience they usually are, a forgery on a loan document, leveraging shared assets. This goes beyond marital infidelity. This is fraud. This is criminal. I'm aware. In that case," he said, opening a drawer, "you don't just need me. You're going to need a very specific kind of lawyer." "I'm not interested in a divorce lawyer," I said immediately. "I'm not here to negotiate custody of the glassware." "I wasn't thinking of one," Arthur said. He pulled out a crisp, cream-colored business card. "I'm thinking of someone who understands corporate malfeasance, asset forfeiture, and criminal fraud. He's quiet, he's methodical, and he doesn't work for the big firms." He slid the card across the desk. I picked it up. The card was thick, heavy linen stock. The lettering was a simple, stark black sans serif Ben Carter, attorney at law. The restaurant was all exposed brick, dangling Edison bulbs, and concrete floors. It was loud, expensive, and smelled of wood smoke and caramelized sugar. It was, in short, one of Marcus's favorite places. "And that," Chloe said, leaning forward, her voice earnest, "is where the ethical data mapping comes in. We're not just selling user behavior, we're curating it. We're helping people become their best selves." She was, I had to admit, a true believer, young, ambitious, and utterly convinced of her own and Marcus's genius. She sat next to him on the distressed leather banquette, her knee almost touching his under the table. She wore a simple, expensive-looking silk dress, her dark hair pulled back in a sleek bun. She looked like a living advertisement for the life Marcus wanted. And I, sitting opposite them, was the supportive, progressive, and evolving wife. I was playing my part. "It sounds incredibly ambitious, Chloe," I said, swirling the deep red Cabernet in my glass. The wine was too jammy, too alcoholic. "I'm impressed. I can see why Marcus is so excited, right?" Marcus beamed, sliding his arm around Chloe's shoulder. It was a casual, proprietary gesture. "She's a rock star. And now that you're on board, Elle, with the house, we can really hit the accelerator." "To the accelerator," I said, raising my glass. Chloe raised hers, her bright, clear eyes meeting mine. "To Alara. Seriously, thank you. I know this must have been, I don't know, a process for you, but it's so amazing that you're this supportive." "She's my partner," Marcus said, as if that explained everything. "Alara's the most intelligent woman I know. She needs to see the blueprints before she trusts the design. Don't you, Elle?" "Something like that," I said, taking a sip. The wine burned all the way down. "Speaking of which, Chloe, Innovate LLC is a great name. But Marcus mentioned this all started from some seed money you'd already raised. You must have been incredibly convincing in your initial pitch." I was fishing. I was using the cover of my due diligence to probe. Chloe flushed, a combination of wine and pride. "Oh, that was mostly Marcus. He was my first believer." She looked at him, her gaze adoring. "He found the seed money for me months ago, just to get the LLC filed and the servers running. He said it was from, what was it, honey? An old art form? Something you'd had sitting around forever." Marcus stiffened, just for a second. His smile became a fraction too wide. Just liquidating some old dusty assets, Elle. Stuff we hadn't looked at in years. Pointless to keep it sitting in a vault when it could be working. An art fund. I filed the words away, placing them neatly in my mental spreadsheet right next to Chloe R. Lang. I placed my napkin on the table. Well, this has been truly illuminating. I smiled at them both. If you'll excuse me, I actually have plans of my own. That got Marcus's full attention. His head snapped back to me. Plans? What plans? Just a date, I said, gathering my purse. I kept my tone light, breezy. I was, after all, following the rules of our open arrangement. You two enjoy the dessert. The Vallerona chocolate sphere here is supposedly life-changing. I didn't look back as I walked out. The hostess smiled at me. Have a wonderful night, Dr. Vance. I intend to, I said. I'd told Marcus I was dating. I hadn't told him who. The bar I chose was the antithesis of Marcus's restaurant. It was in the basement of an old downtown hotel, all dark wood, worn brass, and quiet jazz. It smelled of bourbon, leather, and old books. The patrons spoke in low murmurs. Ben Carter was sitting in a booth in the back corner. He stood when he saw me, a gesture so old-fashioned it was almost startling. He was tall, methodical, and had the quiet, observant eyes of a man who listens for a living. He wore a simple, dark gray suit, the kind that was expensive but didn't advertise it. He looked nothing like Marcus. Dr. Vank, he started. Alara, I said, sliding into the booth. In this context, it's Alara. It's supposed to be a date, remember? A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Ilara, thank you for meeting me. He gestured to the table. He had a glass of whiskey, neat. I'd ordered a club soda from the waitress on my way in. He slid a plain, unmarked brown envelope across the polished wood. It was thick, Arthur Finley's preliminary report. My stomach, which had been a cold knot of dread all night, tightened further. But this was a different kind of anxiety. This was the anxiety of the hunt. I opened the clasp. It's exactly as you suspected, Ben said, his voice low. He wasn't a man who wasted words. Finley found a clear pattern. Small transfers, starting 18 months ago, 5,000 here, 10,000 there, from a joint savings account you share with your husband. The walking around money, I murmured, scanning the columns of numbers. He was testing the water, Ben said. Testing to see if you'd notice. When you didn't, he got bolder. 6 months ago, the transfers stopped, and a new account was opened. Innovate LLC. Funded by? That's the problem. The initial funding, $50,000, didn't come from any account Finley can access. It was a wire transfer from a holding company. But he tapped a line on the report. That same week, your husband took out a personal loan. He used collateral. I looked at the line he was pointing to. Collateral. The Vance Miller Collection. Private art. Chloe's words from dinner echoed in my head. An old art fund. Something you'd had sitting around forever. The Vance Miller Collection, I said, my voice barely a whisper. That was my mother's. A small private collection of modernist sketches. Kandinsky Klee, worth a lot more than $50,000. Ben looked at me, his gaze steady, analytical, but not unkind. He leveraged it, Alara, but to do that, to leverage a jointly owned asset like that, he would have needed your signature. I stared at the paper, but I wasn't seeing it. I was seeing my mother's name. I was seeing my name, Alara Vance Miller. The name I'd stopped using professionally because Marcus found it clunky. I never signed anything, I said. Ben leaned back, his eyes narrowing. Then we have a new foundation to examine. Finley found the loan application at a small private arts and antiquities firm. He couldn't get the signature page, not without a subpoena. But I can, I said, the cold, clear certainty returning. I'm Dr. Alara Vance. The university archives, the city museum. I have access. The art world is small, Ben. Everyone knows everyone. Be careful, he said. If he thinks you're digging, he thinks I'm on a date, he said, closing the envelope. He thinks I'm finally evolving. He thinks I'm just like him. He has no idea. I met Ben's eyes. He wasn't just a lawyer. He was the first person in a year who had looked at me and seen an intelligent woman, not a problem to be managed. He saw the historian. He saw the analyst. He's wrong, Ben said simply. I picked up my club soda. The ice clinked against the glass. It was the only sound. He forged my name, I said. It wasn't a question. It was a hypothesis, and I was going to prove it. The Austin art world wasn't just small. It was intimate. It was a tight network of old money, new tech money, and the academics who gave both legitimacy. My credentials as Dr. Vance, the architectural historian, were a master key. I didn't go to the lender. I went to the curator. Dr. Genevieve Harding was the senior curator of modern works at the Blanton. She was a woman who lived in archival quality, climate-controlled rooms, and her office smelled of acid-free paper and old, expensive tea. We'd served on a dozen dissertation committees together. Ilara, she said, her voice a dry rustle. She peered at me over her half-moon glasses. This is a surprise. I thought you were deep in your brutalism research. I am, Jen, I said, sitting in the hard, upright chair she offered. But a side project has come up. A potential paper on the provenance and private leveraging of the Central Texas modernist collections. Specifically, the Klee and Kandinsky sketches that arrived in the 60s. Her eyes lit up. That was her territory. The Vance Miller collection, you mean? Your mother's pieces. Exquisite. Exactly. I gave her a strained academic smile. My husband. Well, Marcus is Marcus. He's in tech, you know. He recently used the collection as collateral for some venture. It got me thinking about the process, the paperwork, how these private lenders verify and insure such ephemeral assets. Genevieve sniffed, a slight show of disdain for the venture part. Vultures, most of them. They treat masterpieces like mortgage-backed securities. This one was a small private firm, I said, sliding a name across her desk. Brazos Antiquities and Capital. She recognized it. Ah, yes, they're thorough. They fancy themselves connoisseurs. They would have demanded high-resolution scans of every piece, plus the full provenance record, and of course, the signed collateral agreement. That's the document I'm interested in, I said, leaning in. For my research, the legal framework, I was hoping, given our work together, you might have a contact there who would share the form of the agreement? As an academic courtesy? She tapped her pen on her blotter. Let me do you one better. They use our archival services for third-party verification. Their connoisseur is my former research assistant. I'll simply request a file on the Vance Miller collection for a curatorial review. He'll send it without a second thought. She picked up the phone. I sat perfectly still. I listened to her use words like provenance and archival integrity. Within 10 minutes, a secure, encrypted email link landed in my university inbox. I thanked her, my hands steady, my voice professional. I didn't open the file in her office. I walked back to my car, the Austin sun so bright it felt like an assault. I drove to a nondescript coffee shop miles from campus, ordered a black coffee I didn't want, and sat in a dim corner. I opened my laptop. I clicked the link. The file contained scans of all 12 sketches. My mother's handwriting was on the back of each one. And then, the last document, the loan and collateral agreement. I scrolled past the boilerplate legal text. I scrolled to the final page. There they were. 2 signatures, side by side, Marcus B. Vance. His familiar, arrogant, left-leaning scrawl, all sharp peaks and dramatic underlines. And next to it, Ilara Vance Miller. My breath hitched. It was a masterful forgery. It was a piece of art in itself. He had clearly practiced. He'd captured the broad strokes, the general shape of my hand. He must have traced it from old tax returns or bank loans, back when I still used my mother's name, but he'd gotten it wrong. He'd made the E too round. My E was always sharp, an echo of the architectural drawings I loved. He'd looped the V into the M with a flourish, a sign of confidence. I always separated them. My M was a clean 3-peaked structure, printed. His forgery was fluid. It was performative. He had tried to impersonate me, and in the end, he had only revealed himself. I stared at the signature until it blurred. The buzzing of the coffee shop faded. The smell of burnt beans and sugar disappeared. There was only the white light of the screen and the black lying ink. This was the smoking gun. This was the blueprint of his betrayal, signed and dated. Any lingering vestigial piece of me that still thought of myself as his wife, as his partner, evaporated. The sadness I had been carrying for a year didn't just turn to ice. It sublimated, turning from a solid weight into a sharp, invisible, pressurized gas. It filled my lungs. I closed the laptop. I didn't need to cry. I didn't need to rage. I needed to make a phone call. The next meeting with Ben and Arthur was in Ben's office. It was as methodical and quiet as he was. No tweed, just clean lines, law books, and a view of the state capitol. Arthur Finley was already there, holding a slim new report. I didn't say hello. I walked to the conference table, opened my laptop, and turned it for them to see. I zoomed in on the signature page. "I never signed that," I said. Arthur put on his reading glasses. Ben leaned in, his face grim. "He practiced," I said, my voice as flat as the table. "But he made the E too round." Arthur looked at me, then at the screen. He let out a low, slow whistle. "My God, that's blatant. That's federal wire fraud, just to start." "This is no longer a civil matter, Ilara," Ben said. His voice was cold. This was his territory now. "This is a criminal conspiracy. Forgery, fraud. He used your identity to steal your assets and fund his mistress. We have him. We have part of him," I said. Arthur cleared his throat. He tapped the new folder he'd brought. "Speaking of which, your hypothesis about the art fund gave me a new place to look. I stopped just tracing money from your joint accounts. I started looking at the money going into his company." He opened the folder. More spreadsheets. Marcus's company, Ethica, just closed a new round of VC funding, correct? $20 million? "Yes," I said. "He's hosting a party for it in 2 weeks. He's insufferable." "Well," Arthur said, pointing to a line. "His quarterly reports for the last year? The ones he used to get that funding. They're creative. Very creative. He's been booking projected revenue as earned income. He's inflating his user acquisition numbers. He's cooking the books. His entire ethical brand is leveraged on a mountain of fraudulent data." I looked at Ben. His expression was perfectly still, but I could see the calculation in his eyes. Marcus hadn't just built his new life with Chloe on a lie. He'd built his entire professional life on one. He'd forged my name to get seed money for one fraudulent company, and he'd forged his data to get venture capital for another. The man was a structural fraud. His entire life was a facade. "So he's defrauding me," I said, "and he's defrauding his investors." "And the investors," Ben said, "are the kind of people who do not like to be defrauded. We're talking about venture capital firms that have teams of lawyers who exist purely to litigate." A new plan began to form in my mind. A blueprint, a beautiful, terrible piece of architecture. It wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about everything. It was about systematic demolition. "That party," I said, my mind moving quickly. "The one to celebrate the new funding. It's at our house. All the investors will be there. The board members, the whole Austin tech scene." Ben and Arthur looked at me. "That seems inconvenient," Arthur said. "No," I said. "It's perfect. It's a stage." I thought of the contacts I'd made over the years. The academics, the donors, the journalists I'd met at endless university fundraisers and museum galas. Marcus had always called them Ilara's boring friends. "I know someone," I said, the words tasting sharp and clean in my mouth. "A journalist. Sarah Jenkins. She's a high-profile tech reporter for Wired." I looked at Ben. "She did an expose on a green energy CEO last year that landed him in front of Congress." I smiled. It was a cold, unfamiliar feeling. And if I recall, she despises ethical hypocrites. I did not use my own computer. I didn't use my phone, or the university's network, or even our home Wi-Fi. I drove to a branch of the Austin Public Library in a neighborhood I never frequented. A low brick building that smelled of old paper, industrial carpet cleaner, and the faint, sweet tang of homeless desperation. I sat at a public access computer terminal in a carrel, my back to the room. The keyboard was gritty, the keys worn smooth. The air hummed with the sound of outdated fluorescent lighting. Here, I was just another anonymous face, another person on the margins. I created a new email account. Historia Veritas 88 Proton.me. History, truth. A little on the nose, but it satisfied me. I opened a new message. The recipient was Sarah Jenkins at her Wired email address. I'd found it in the byline of her last scathing article. My fingers, usually so steady on my own keyboard, felt strange on these sticky, unresponsive keys. Subject: a question of ethics at Ethicaeums. Jenkins, you don't know me. I'm an academic. I followed your work on corporate malfeasance. And I admire your refusal to be dazzled by buzzwords. You might be interested to know that Marcus Vance, CEO of Ethica, is currently celebrating a new $20 million round of VC funding. The party is this Saturday. His investors, however, might be less inclined to celebrate if they compared his investor-facing quarterly reports with his actual earnings. I've attached Ethica's internal user acquisition report for Q2 of this year. Compare the numbers, specifically the active user metric, to the projections he filed with his funders for the same period. The math is creative. He's booking projected revenue as earned income. He's selling a ghost. This is a breadcrumb. I trust you'll know where it leads. A colleague. I attached a single sanitized PDF from Arthur's report. Just one. Just enough to prove I was real. I hit send, I logged out. I wiped the browser history, cleared the cache, and rebooted the machine. I stood up and walked out of the library, melting back into the anonymous afternoon traffic. The fuse was lit. Now I just had to wait for the spark to catch. The waiting was the hardest part. The waiting and the performance. The house was in a state of controlled chaos. Marcus was euphoric, a man on the verge of his own coronation. He was a whirlwind of frantic, joyous energy. Caterers, florists, and lighting technicians paraded through our minimalist home. No, the ice luge has to go by the pool, he was saying into his phone, gesturing wildly. It's all about flow, people. And Chloe's designed a custom Ethica cocktail, the transparent innie. Isn't that brilliant? He hung up and saw me standing in the kitchen entryway, holding my university bag. Elle, there you are. He kissed me, a quick, dry peck. He smelled of expensive hair gel and anxiety. What do you think? It's going to be perfect, right? The whole board will be here. The new VCs are flying in from Palo Alto. It sounds wonderful, Marcus, I said. My voice was a perfect imitation of a supportive wife. You've worked so hard for this. You deserve to celebrate. We, he corrected me, magnanimous. We deserve it, especially after you came on board. He squeezed my shoulder. It means everything, Alara. Everything. My stomach felt like it was full of cold, wet cement. I had to force the smile to stay on my face. I'm going to go grade some papers. Right. You do that. He was already pulling out his phone, already back to his party. I met Ben in the park the next day. It was a neutral space, full of jogging strollers and dogs. We sat on a bench, not looking at each other. Just two strangers watching the world go by. She took the bait, Ben said, his voice quiet, directed at the duck pond in front of us. My heart gave a single hard thump. You're sure? Arthur got an electronic alert. A reporter named Sarah Jenkins just filed a public records request for Ethica's original articles of incorporation and all state regulatory filings. She's pulling the public thread. Good, I said, my hands clenched in the pockets of my jacket. But the public thread is clean. He's not stupid. She needs the reports he didn't file. The ones he showed the VCs. She knows that, Ben said. A journalist like that. She knows she's being fed. She'll ask for the rest. And when she does, I give her the forgery, the art fund, Arthur's entire report. I finished. But not yet, he agreed. The party is the stage. You want maximum impact. You want the investors to find out while they're drinking his transparent innies. I almost smiled. Yes, that's exactly what I want. That night, I was in my office. The house was finally quiet. Marcus was asleep, resting up for his big day. I took out the burner phone I'd bought, a cheap pay-as-you-go slab of plastic. I connected to the neighbor's unsecured Wi-Fi. I logged into the Proton Mail account. There was one new message. It had arrived an hour ago from Sarah Jenkins. To Historia Veritas, 88 subject, re, a question of ethics at Ethica. The public numbers are sloppy. I agree, but this isn't the whole story. This is the smoke. You're holding back the fire. Show me the rest. My fingers were perfectly steady this time. I typed my reply. I will. Saturday. 8:00 p.m. Central. You'll want to be watching your inbox. I hit send. The fuse was now impossibly short. The party was Saturday at 7 p.m. The party was a roaring success. Our sterile, minimalist house was finally full, but not with life. It was full of noise, heat, and the collective amplified sound of 100 egos congratulating each other. Marcus had spared no expense. Blue-white lights transformed our backyard into a futuristic lagoon. Waiters in sharp black uniforms moved through the crush, balancing trays of Chloe's signature cocktail, the transparent innie. It was a gin and elderflower concoction, perfectly clear, served with a single suspended blueberry. An eyeball. I was a ghost at my own execution. I wore a dark blue silk dress, simple and severe. It was a color I never wore. It was my armor. I circulated, my smile as brittle and perfect as the wine glasses I held. I was the historian, observing the fall of a minor, self-absorbed empire. Ilara, incredible party. A venture capitalist from Palo Alto bellowed at me, his face slick with sweat and gin. Your husband is a visionary. He certainly has a vision, I replied, my voice smooth. I saw Marcus across the patio. He was at the center of the largest, loudest group, his arms outstretched as he told some anecdote. He was incandescent with triumph. Chloe was beside him, her hand resting in the small of his back. She wore a backless white dress, and she glowed. She looked at him with the kind of blind adoration I had, perhaps, once felt. Or maybe I'd just mistaken it for a good investment. My heart was a cold, still stone in my chest. I felt nothing. No jealousy, no pain, only a profound humming readiness. I checked the slim, elegant watch on my wrist. 7:52 p.m. I felt a subtle shift in the crowd near the entryway. Ben Carter had arrived. He wasn't dressed for a party. He was dressed for work, in the same dark gray suit he always wore. He looked like an undertaker who had lost his way. He took a glass of water from a waiter, his eyes methodically scanning the room. He was looking for the board members, the VCs. He was identifying his targets. He found me. Our eyes met for a single, fractional second across the patio. It was all I needed. He gave a nod so small it was almost imperceptible. It meant the officers are staged. I'm ready, I nodded back. I turned my attention to the bar, straightening a stack of cocktail napkins. 7:55 p.m. Marcus, high on his own supply, clapped his hands together. The sound was sharp, cutting through the din. Friends! Colleagues! Innovators! He shouted, his voice hoarse with joy. He stepped up onto the low retaining wall by the pool, the blue light catching his face. Chloe looked up at him, her hands clasped. Tonight we celebrate. Marcus boomed. We celebrate honesty. A few people cheered, raising their clear blue drinks. We celebrate transparency. We celebrate innovation. This new round of funding, he paused, grinning. This is just the beginning. This is how we build a better, more ethical future. To Ethica! He grabbed a champagne flute from a passing tray and raised it high. My hand was in my clutch, my finger on the smooth, cold glass of the burner phone. My thumb was hovering over the icon for the pre-scheduled message, a draft I had written and rewritten a dozen times. It was set to send at 8:00 p.m., but I wanted the satisfaction of pushing the button myself. My watch chimed, a tiny digital ping. 8:00 p.m. As Marcus opened his mouth to continue his toast, I hit send the email containing Arthur's complete forensic report the high-resolution scan of the forgery, and a detailed summary of the leveraged art collection flew through the digital ether, sent from Historia, Veritas, 88 to Sarah Jenkins at Wired. For a second, nothing happened. Marcus was still talking, and I have to thank my incredible partner Elara, who has been my rock. Then I saw it. The first ripple. A man near the bar, one of the new VCs from Palo Alto, the one who'd called Marcus a visionary, looked down at his phone. His smug, drunken smile froze. It didn't just fade, it hardened. His face went pale, then a dark, mottled red. "What the hell?" he whispered. A woman next to him, a board member, glanced at his screen. Her own phone buzzed. And then, as if a silent alarm had been tripped, phones began to light up all over the patio. A wave of vibrations and pings. Ben, standing near the server station, had just sent his own email. The one with the subject line, "Urgent, legal notice regarding Marcus Vance and Ethica, Inc." It had gone to every board member and every investor at the party. Sarah Jenkins's article had gone live. The Wired headline, I would later learn, was brutal. Ethical Myths. Austin CEO Marcus Vance accused of fraud. Forgery in 20 mm House of Cards. The sound of the party died. The roar of 100 conversations collapsed into a thick, sudden, suffocating silence. The only sound was the techno music still pulsing from the hidden speakers. Marcus hadn't noticed. He was still holding his glass aloft. To all of you, he stammered, his smile faltering as he sensed the seismic shift in the atmosphere. What's wrong? "Marcus," said the VC, his voice shaking with a cold, precise rage. He held up his phone. "What is this? I don't..." Marcus's eyes darted around. He saw the faces. He saw a dozen phones all pointed at him, their screens glowing with the Wired article. And then, as if on cue, two men walked through the open patio door. They were not guests. They were in plain clothes, but they moved with a weight and authority that was unmistakable. They were the officers Ben had called. They scanned the crowd, their eyes landing, as instructed, on Ben. Ben gave a simple, definitive tip of his head. "Toward Marcus Vance," the taller officer said, his voice calm, but it carried over the entire silent yard. Marcus's head whipped around. He saw the article on the VC's phone. He saw the contempt on his board members' faces. He saw the two officers walking toward him. His eyes, wide and frantic, searched the crowd. He was looking for me. He found me. I was standing right where I had been, about 10 feet away by the bar. I hadn't moved. My face was perfectly, beautifully calm. I was no longer a ghost. I was the architect. He stared at me, his mouth open, the champagne glass still held uselessly in his hand. In his eyes, I saw the entire frantic calculation. Elara, the bank, the investment, the journalist, the police. Elara, the glass slipped from his fingers and shattered on the stone patio. "You forged my name, Marcus," I said. My voice was not loud. It was not a shriek. It was a clear, cold, academic statement of fact. But in the dead silence, it carried like a gunshot. The officers stopped. The board members turned to me. "The house," I continued, my gaze locked with his. "The art, my mother's art, all of it." His face, the handsome, charismatic, triumphant mask, didn't just fall. It broke. It shattered, just like the glass at his feet, revealing the hollow, terrified, and guilty man underneath. The aftermath was not a single explosion. It was a series of controlled demolitions. The first was in a glass-walled boardroom 22 floors above the city. The air smelled of expensive, stale coffee and the ozone hum of high-end electronics. The morality clause is explicit. Marcus, the venture capitalist from Palo Alto, the one who'd called Marcus a visionary, was speaking. His voice was dead, stripped of all its party night bluster. "Fraudulent inducement, forgery. You didn't just lie to us. You made us your accomplices. Marcus sat at the far end of the long, polished table. He was gray. His tan was gone. He looked like a building in the instant before it implodes. He was silent. The Ethica board chair, a woman I'd hosted at my dinner table, didn't even look at him. She looked at Ben, who stood quietly against the wall, a dark gray suit, a silent witness. "The board activates the clause," she said, her voice sharp. "Marcus Vance is terminated, effective immediately. His shares are clawed back. His seat is forfeit." Someone closed a laptop. The click of the latch was the sound of a lock turning. His company, his ethical brand, his entire professional identity, all of it was gone in under 15 minutes. The second demolition happened a week later. I was in a bright, anonymous coffee shop near Ben's office, waiting for the final divorce papers. I was stirring a black coffee, watching the steam rise, when a shadow fell across my table. It was Chloe. The sleek, confident app designer from the party was unrecognizable. Her dark hair was in a greasy, frantic bun. Her face was pale and puffy, her eyes red-rimmed. She wore a stained sweatshirt. She was 28, and in that moment, she looked older than I did. "You," she whispered, her voice cracking. She was vibrating with a desperate, pathetic anger. I just looked at her. I waited. "He said you knew." Her voice rose, and a few people at the next table looked up. "He said you were in on it. He said it was your idea to invest." I took a slow sip of my coffee. It was hot, bitter. "He said a lot of things, Chloe. You ruined me," she cried, tears welling. "The LLC is frozen. The investors, my name. It's all tied to him. I've lost everything." I looked at her, and the last cold ember of my bitterness finally died. I felt nothing. No triumph. No satisfaction. Just the cold pity a historian feels for a minor, predictable tragedy. She was just another casualty of his structural failure. "He told me your name was Innovate LLC, I said, my voice quiet, precise. "He never mentioned you. Not as a person. You were just another one of his assets, Chloe, an investment. And when it went bad, he leveraged you, just like he leveraged my mother's art." She stared at me, the accusation dying on her lips, replaced by a dawning, horrifying understanding. She had never been his partner. She had just been his startup. I picked up my bag and stood. "You should get a lawyer. A different one." She sank into the chair I had just vacated, a small, broken thing. I walked out into the bright, indifferent sunshine. The final demolition was in Ben's office. Marcus was there. He'd been forced to trade his high-powered corporate lawyers for a tired-looking man in a rumpled suit. Marcus, stripped of his charm, his money, and his audience, had only one weapon left. "You did this," he hissed, his voice a low, venomous whine. He was trying to find the old dynamic, the one where I was the problem, the one where my feelings were an inconvenience. "You were never happy. You were never satisfied. You just wanted to punish me for being free. You couldn't stand that I was happy." I didn't answer. I just looked at Ben. Ben, in his methodical way, slid a single laminated sheet of paper across the table. It was the signature page. "The forgery, Marcus," Ben said, his voice flat. "This is not a negotiation. This is a criminal proceeding that we are graciously settling civilly. You will sign the divorce decree as written. Ilara gets the house, the accounts, and the full, undisputed title to the Vance Miller art collection." Marcus stared at the forgery. His last little line. His masterpiece. "What? What do I get?" he whispered, his voice small. I stood up. I looked at the man I had spent 22 years of my life with. The vibrant, charismatic ideas guy. He was just a cheap, hollow forgery. "You get to keep Chloe," I said, "and you get to stay out of prison." I walked out without looking back. Weeks later, the house was finally empty. I stood in the vast white living room. The polished concrete floor was scarred and marked from where the minimalist furniture had been. The room echoed. It was just a box. I was supervising the movers as they carried out the last of it. The ugly, uncomfortable, expensive pieces Marcus had chosen. The sound of the diesel truck's ramp thudding against the curb was the most satisfying sound I'd ever heard. Ben appeared in the doorway. He was in weekend clothes, a simple dark blue Henley. He was holding 2 paper cups. He handed one to me. It was coffee. Real coffee, black and strong. "I signed the final deed of sale this morning," I said, taking a sip. "The new owners are a tech couple from California. They love the austere minimalism." "Good," he said. He looked around at the echoing empty space. "It's a beautiful piece of architecture, but it was never a home." "No," I agreed. "It was just a balance sheet." We stood in silence for a moment, the sound of the tape gun echoing from the truck. "Where will you go now, Ilara?" he asked. It wasn't a personal question. It was a practical one. The question of a friend, I smiled. A real one this time. "I have a new place. An old one, actually. And then, a sabbatical." My new apartment was on the top floor of a 1930s building downtown. It was small. It was all warm, original hardwood floors that creaked, built-in bookshelves that were warped with age, and tall, wavy glass windows. It smelled of old wood, floor wax, and the thousands of books I was finally unpacking. It was cluttered. It was full of my historical blueprints, my research, my mother's sketches, the real ones, and a comfortable, overstuffed sofa. It was imperfect and solid and entirely unequivocally mine. I didn't stay long. My final image wasn't of a house at all. It was of a seat, 14A, window, on a 787 flying nonstop to Rome. The plane was a pressurized, sterile tube, but I had never felt so free. The flight attendant came by, the cart rattling softly. "Ma'am, something to drink before we push back?" "A glass of wine," I said. "The driest white you have." She smiled and poured a pale, straw-colored Sauvignon Blanc. It was crisp, acidic, and perfect. I looked out the window as the ground crew pulled the jet bridge away. The terminal, a monument of steel and glass, detached itself from the plane. I pulled a new notebook from my bag. Not a spreadsheet, not a legal pad. A new leather-bound journal with thick, cream-colored empty pages. I opened it to the first page. The engines began to whine, a low, powerful rumble that vibrated through the floor, up my seat, and into my bones. It wasn't the sound of an ending. It was the sound of a foundation. I uncapped my pen, took a sip of wine, and as the plane began to move, I began to write.